The Portola Valley and Alpine Railroad was established in 1979. They're celebrating the completion of the addition of approximately 5,000 feet of track for the new Caboose Camp and Lumber Camp loops. The loops include new bridges, a trestle, and a tunnel. It's the result of 7 years of effort brought to you by master craftsmen of every discipline who love to build and run trains.
Thanks everyone for coming today. People have traveled from far and wide to get here. Planes, trains, Ubers, cars, bicycles, motorcycles I've seen. And today we're having a golden spike ceremony for the joining of the two sections of track. The trestle's been staring at us for a number of years. We can finally get here. That doesn't mean we're done. It just means we can get from point A to point B. We've got a lot to go. And, you know, first I wanted to offer thanks to the Littlefield family for hosting us for all these years, encouraging us, putting up with us, sponsoring us. And I know that our spouses thank them also, especially during COVID, for having us get out of the house. Don't you need to go to trains? Don't you need to do something? Yes, I do. Okay, come back for dinner if you want to. So, moving things along, you know, there's quite a bit of history of the railroad, some I know, and more of which Bill knows. So let me turn it over to Bill to give us a little bit of history of how this all got started. I know I came up one day and saw the tanks and the trains and said, I don't really care about tanks, I care about trains. And 5 years later, I'm still at it.
It's cool.
Thank you, Bob. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to start by just introducing the family. So the family members are in here. We've got Jacques' wife, Liz, and Jacques' wife, Janet. And we've got Jacques' sister, Denise. And with Denise is Jake and Roman and also Jacques' Kate private school classmate, and I guess David couldn't make it today, so that basically represents the family and friends. Thank you very much. So Bob said, how did this get started? But he mentioned the tanks. He came up here first to talk about the tanks. And so let me use Jacques' passion for tanks as a metaphor. By the way, with respect to the full-size stuff, the trains came first. If they hadn't, the trains would have never occurred because when the tanks finally arrived on site, they really took over. But starting earlier in life, Jacques did have model trains and he did have model tanks. But to describe Jacques' tank collecting philosophy, a lot of the docents said his collection strategy was yes. And that was not too dissimilar to the first conversation he and I had about the railroad. I was interested in building a train, and I met a group of guys. We started to do it together, and the guys had trains, but they didn't have a place to run it. And I said, I know just the guy, and persuading him would be like the same thing. Persuading Jacques to start the railroad was kind of like falling downhill, a very easy, natural event. And so he did have a request, though. When we first talked about it, Jacques said, I'm not interested in ever owning the biggest railroad, because if it's the biggest, that might compromise being the best, and I very much want the best railroad regardless of the fact that it'll be small. And so that's been our philosophy here, and I'm going to carry that theme through, because after Jacques' death we had a conversation with the family. I had some conversation with Jacques before he died about maintaining it, and the theme of best is going to come out here a little bit more. So when we started on the railroad, the first year we put a loop around the lake, and the second year we went up toward where that tunnel is down below that you went through, and we started out toward the back, and there's a big turnaround there called Rabbit Flat. And the reason that's there, that's all man-made, is because at that time, if you stood there and looked straight back where we were headed, about another 200 or 300 yards out there, there was a telephone pole that fed the power to the back cow barn. And the telephone pole looked like that. And that was a dead giveaway to the fact that the land out there was very unstable. And Jacques took one look at that and said, we're going to turn around here and come back. So that was the end of going in that direction. As we came back here, the original plan, actually we talked about ending up on this soccer field. And the soccer field up here where the tunnel is now was not that high at the time. And so that was an intention all along that was never fulfilled. And when we proposed doing that, we wanted to do one other thing, and that was when the idea came about. If we come up to the soccer field, we thought about putting another loading area up there as well as the loading area down below. But when you depart there, if you just come up with a double track and then follow a double back down, the railroad gets memorized very easily, because what you do is the same thing, you go back and then you go around once and you have to go by the station every time. And so in order to allow for some opportunities, we said, well, if we go back and we cross over, and when you go back to Rabbit Flat, enter it clockwise just like the original one, that would give you some options to return back to the top or go to our lumber camp, what have you. So that was the concept from the original 1979. It was only partly fulfilled, and when we started this expansion with the family, then the first part of it was those silver bridges that you drive under those silver bridges, and they are there specifically to get the track to the other side, so you could do that. When we had the first discussion with the family, they were pretty clear too about best. And so best meant, I think, three things. So there's visibly best, let me mention that first. And visibly best, Jacques designed and built the first station house and the first engine house, and I think it was very attractive. This wooden trestle, I think, is really unique in this hobby, and that would qualify. I think the new tunnel we've added qualifies. The lumber camp bridge, the big black bridge, which we didn't cross coming up here, and we won't cross going back unless we come back up part way. The signaling system, basically we've tried to stay thematic, and the theme has changed a little bit. Originally it was 1.5 inches to the foot to the 1/8 scale, but if you look at this railroad, the good news is the bad news is the good news. The good news is there's lots of land. The bad news is it's very steep, which makes it very difficult to expand. Unlike if you're in the desert, you just throw another loop, but that's also the good news, because if you solve that problem, it means tunnels and trestles and things. As a result, this railroad has a lot of 23-degree curves. Mainline railroads in the U.S. didn't like 10-degree curves. So this railroad is a lot of very, very tight curves. Actually, they're the minimum that these trains can operate on. And there's a lot of steep grades. So this is very much like you would see in the Colorado Rockies with the narrow gauge engines. And so some of us have moved to the 2.5 to the foot, 1/5 scale in order to take advantage of this. So this is now, the theme of this is really a narrow gauge railroad. Now, on the way to getting to this, we built an interim bridge, the lumber camp bridge down there. It's got a plaque on it, you'll see it. And that was for the lumber camp, and so we never had a ceremony associated with that. So the Shay is here as a logging engine to kind of represent that which never got a ceremony. And the K36 here is here representing the rest of the narrow gauge. Both of those engines were, and the prototypes actually ran on the narrow gauge. So that's the visibly best. We're trying to make it look like. Invisibly best, I think, is perhaps even more important to Jacques and maybe in the family, and that means that hidden under this, there's a lot of technical details. And the reason I want to share some of those with you is just to put in perspective. I was reviewing a film that I made a number of years ago, and somebody asked me what you liked most about the railroad, and I was surprised. I said, well, the people, what you get into. Well, the people is incredible. If you look at this on the surface, there is an incredible amount of talent and effort that went into this, most of which you won't see. And so I'm going to call that the invisible best. And behind that is a plethora of support from members like the family, a lot of members in the audience here that helped build this railroad over the years. There's 2 or 3 people here that have been here since the beginning, 1979, and they'll understand what I mean. And I'll give you an example. I think that under a lot of the track up there on the hill, there's a steel substructure which you wouldn't see. There's some bridges that have been buried, and that's because we wanted it to look like it was grade level, but we wanted the longevity and the rigidity of a steel structure. So we've done that. The tunnel, there's 3 very nice tunnels that I'm aware of in this hobby. Let me rephrase that. Up until last year, there were 3 very nice tunnels that were similar to this in this hobby. And one of those disappeared a long time ago down at Better Creek. The second of those disappeared last year in Oregon because they came to the end of their useful life and they collapsed and they filled in and they were all made out of wood. This tunnel, you'll notice, has a steel structure inside. Not only that, it's engineered with drainage underneath it and drainage on the side. It's covered with a multiplicity of technical things I won't go into to give it what we've guaranteed the family be a sort of a 50-year life. So this one shouldn't fall in like those. But as another example of how one thing leads to another, I was looking back at some of our construction notes and I found a reference about the tunnel here. And it talks about the fact that the note to self, do not increase the stud spacing on the uphill side of the tunnel beyond 3.5 feet center line for 4-inch channel unless the corbels are greater than 2 feet diagonal. So what does that mean? Turns out that we wanted to make the tunnel a nominal width for construction purposes, but wide enough to allow 2 trains of this side to pass each other inside, and that meant basically 3.5 foot center line. But you're going around a 50-foot radius, which is our minimum radius, and that means they take a little more room because they cut across the corner. And if you start with regular lumber dimensions, in order to do that, we came up with a critical requirement, or only you have 4 inches. And if you take 4 inches and you decide you're going to use channel, which is the right material for the cost and strength, and you use 5 pound per foot channel, you run into an interesting situation, which is the weight of the dirt on the upside of the hill and the weight of the dirt on the top pushing down means that 4-inch 5 pound channel can only be 4.5 feet tall, otherwise it can buckle at 3.5 feet, which is the spacing which I mentioned in here. No, 4.5 feet spacing. You could solve that by putting studs a lot closer, or you can solve it by shortening the thing and making the top very small, or you can solve it by putting in a corbel like we did, which takes the strength of the roof down into the sides, and that's a given dimension. That's the 42 inches. 42 inches from the floor, you have to have a piece of steel that goes up and attaches the ceiling if that piece of steel is 2 feet long and goes up at a 30-degree angle. So my point is that everything depends on everything else, and the building of this railroad was that's a metaphor for us relying on each other's skills to do the same things. There's a lot of structure that's hidden. The things that you see, the visible things, are very rewarding. Congratulations to everybody that participated, but thank you especially for all the effort that you put in behind that, because all of these things depend on each other in order to do that job. And then beyond the visibly best, I have a third thing, which is longevity, and that is again, the family specifically said, can you make a structure that will last with minimal maintenance a long period of time? And so we are in the process of doing that. Some of the original railroad, once this project is completed, will have to be redone to this new tie system that we're developing and everything. But also, when you went across this last little bridge, the little curved bridge underneath the redwoods, that is in the grove there with all those redwoods, and you know what redwood roots do, they move and everything like that. And so that bridge is actually built on a special structure that's adjustable. So as the redwood roots grow, that bridge can be moved down over time to match that. So that's the third of the best criteria, if you will, the maintainability. So with that, I want to move on to the ceremony, and Jacques' sister Denise, who has been a tremendous supporter, has agreed to do the honors and drive the spike. And as soon as this is done, we'll touch the pilots, and then we're going to break and have ice cream and try and get that. It's actually gold plated. Don't steal it; it's not worth much. Working.
All right.
Good job.
Well,
Come back next week, we've only got 10,000 more.
Okay.
Good job.
yeah, no.